We are recording the interview of David Wood. This interview is being conducted by Erica Carter and Jeremy Tack from the Wright State Veterans Voices Project. Also in attendance are a small studio audience. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the New Media Incubator. It is 10:11 a.m. on October 26, 2018. Thank you for coming.
So happy to be here.
All right, well, let's get started. Let's begin with where and when were you born?
So I was born in 1945, a long time ago, and in Mineola, which is a city in Long Island, just outside of New York, about 25, 30 miles outside of Manhattan. And so I grew up in a kind of an isolated suburban town because it was on a peninsula and sort of cut off from everything else. So it was basically a small town where I grew up.
Mm-hmm. Who were your parents and what did they do?
So my dad was a cabinet maker, basically. He worked with wood,
Mm-hmm.
and early in his career he built furniture for wealthy people, really beautiful, fine furniture, and then eventually started to design and have built church and synagogue furniture and then interiors, so that in the full part of his career he was doing big church and synagogue projects with stained glass and tapestry and woodworking, and it was like that. And he had a wood shop where he employed 4 or 5 people, and so I spent a lot of time when I was a kid in the wood shop making projects and getting into trouble and trying not to cut my finger off in the saw, that kind of thing. And then my mother was a children's librarian. So she worked in the local public library. So I also spent a lot of time in the library. And she was a storyteller. So she would, on Sunday mornings at the local library, Saturday mornings, she would have a story hour. The kids would sit on a carpet in front of her and she'd show them a storybook and read it, picture book. But during the week, she would walk around the house memorizing the storybook so she could tell the story while she was showing the pictures to the kids. So I grew up with the idea that that was something you could be, like a storyteller. It was like you could be a pilot or a fireman or a cowboy or a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
And so that figured in my life as I stumbled through college and on into my career, was always the idea that storytelling was something you could do, like a job, which was pretty unusual, I think. But anyway, that's where I got the idea.
Huh. Do you have any siblings?
Yes, I have an older sister and an older brother and a younger brother. So none of them went into journalism as I did. My younger brother is a composer, and my older brother is a biochemist here at Wright State. I think he's retired. And my older sister has been a hospice nurse for her career.
All right.
Yeah.
Do you have any family members that served in the military?
No, I had some uncles who served in the military during World War II, but I never knew what they did, never talked to them about it, and so no military influence in my life when I was growing up.
So you became a journalist,
Yeah.
and that somewhat stemmed from your mother telling stories. What, besides that, made you want to be a journalist?
So this is a little embarrassing, but this is how it happened. So I always, in the back of my mind, thought it would be interesting to be a journalist. And so I went to college. I flunked out at the end of my junior year, yeah. And then I was sort of drifting, and I met these guys who were Time magazine correspondents, foreign correspondents. And they were all handsome, they were well-dressed, they'd been around the world, and they were always in the company of beautiful women, and they knew about wine and stuff, which we never had any alcohol in my house when I was growing up. And I was like, that's what I want to be. I want to be, I want to go drink wine and hang around beautiful women and have adventures and fly off, and that's glamorous. I want to do that. So that's really how it got started. It's not a very, it's not something I'm terrifically proud of, but that's what really got me going. And so in a fairly short period of time, I became a Time magazine foreign correspondent, covering wars. And it wasn't glamorous at all, and there were no beautiful women around. And, you know, so, but by that time I was hooked on the whole business of storytelling. So that's how I got started. And, you know, after I flunked out, okay, let me start back with the family that I grew up in. My family they were Quakers and pacifists. And so not only didn't I know anybody in the military when I was growing up, but we didn't think highly of people in the military because they caused wars and started wars, and we didn't want to have anything to do with that. I thought it was the wrong thing to do. And when I was probably 10, my family hosted one of the Hiroshima Maidens, and these were women who'd been schoolgirls when we dropped the atomic bomb. And they had survived, but they were horribly burned. And I think it was Quakers who brought them to this country for plastic surgery. And this would have been in the mid-50s or late 50s. Anyway, so one of these women stayed at our house for weeks. And so the first person that I knew who had any direct experience with war wasn't a warrior in a great uniform and, you know, all that stuff, but a schoolgirl that my country had tried to incinerate. And that made a huge impression on me. I mean, she was just hard to look at, you know, but so nice, and we got to be very close. But so that's the environment that I grew up in. And so when I turned 18, had to register for the draft, I registered as a conscientious objector. And at that point, you had to go before a draft board, which was, you know, it was a bunch of World War II veterans. So they were all, to my mind, possibly ancient. And they had to determine whether I got my conscientious objector status or not. And so they wanted to know things like, you know, if someone was trying to rape my mother, would I go to her defense? Would I fight to save her? And questions like that, which I found pretty easy to answer. But anyway, so I got my CO status, and then I had to do 2 years of civilian service instead of going into the military. So I did that in Philadelphia, and went to night school at the same time. Finally, you know, dragged myself out of college, got my degree, and then went off to be a journalist. So at first I thought being a photographer would be that would be fun and be glamorous. So I spent a long time trying to perfect my skills as a photographer. And embarrassingly, I went to the Black Star photo agency. So at the time, Black Star was like, it was like the absolute pinnacle. Every world famous photographer worked for Black Star. I mean, it was like the absolute pinnacle of photojournalists. So I showed up there at their office in New York and said I was looking for a job, and they were like, well, let's see what you've done. I had my portfolio, you know. So it was so embarrassing. They looked at it and they were like, you know, you might try writing. So that was the end of that. And so then I started my journalism career. Yeah.
So as a conscientious objector, do you still prescribe to that status to this day?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting journey. You know, when I was 18, I was pretty convinced that war was wrong, and if people just refused to take part in it, it would stop. And I was also taken by the idea of nonviolent, a nonviolent approach to conflict, right? So I remember studying the Norwegian idea during World War II, in which when the Germans invaded, they were just like, we're not going to participate in this. We're not going to do our jobs. We're not going to go to school. And it was an interesting example of nonviolent resistance to aggression. I didn't really know that much about it, but it sounded like a much better idea than incinerating schoolgirls, right? Then when I got to be a journalist and eventually went to Africa and for Time magazine and started, I mean, the only stories that the magazine was interested in having me cover were the wars going on. So I became a war correspondent. And I saw a lot of stuff that was like, you know, nonviolent resistance wouldn't have worked in this place. And there were things that I saw that I wanted where innocent people had been killed. And I wanted somebody to come, you know, track down the people who did this and kill them, which was a very un-Quakerly kind of thing. But so that experience pretty early in my career, and how old was I went to Africa? I was 32. So I was fairly young, and it really caused me to, well, I guess I didn't rethink it, but I just was like, put that stuff aside. The whole thing about nonviolent resistance and pacifism, I just sort of put that aside. And I really didn't come back to it until many, many years later when I was covering a lot of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I began to see that the people who I knew, so like the working class military, so not the generals and the people in headquarters, but the people who were out there getting their hands dirty, you know, who I fondly called the working class military. They didn't like war either. They were like, this is screwed up. We should never be doing this. This is horrible. But, you know, I'm proud of my part in doing what I'm doing. I'm doing something difficult, and I'm proud of that, and I love my buddies that I'm working with, and so I find value in that. But the whole thing is like screwed up. And so in a weird way, you know, we came to the same point from different starting points, where I do think that war is, you know, is something that we should never be involved in, that it just never resolves any issue, and it just makes things worse, and people do bad things, and bad things are done to people. But, you know, I do find in wartime, people do amazingly, not just brave and heroic, but generous things, you know? So we could talk about that later.
Your definition of conscientious objection, is that the same as the government's definition?
Yeah, I think so. So as I remember, the government, the official definition of a conscientious objector, or the gate you had to meet, was that you believed for religious reasons that war was evil and you should not take part, and you could not take part in it, that your conscience wouldn't allow you to take part in it. And so because I was officially like a member of the Quaker church, Quaker faith, that was like an automatic, you know, I was like 9/10 of the way there just because I was born into that family. And, you know, because I believed, you know, the stuff that I grew up with, and especially that experience with the woman from Hiroshima. And that was really like, okay, this is not something that I want to be a part of. And instead, I want to do something positive. You know, if I have to, and remember there was a draft at that time. So they were pulling, you know, my friends, my colleagues in to serve in the military, and they were going off. You know, I wanted to do something, in the way of national service, but I wanted that to be more meaningful than going in the military.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to do something positive. So that's sort of. So it was nice that the government had this exemption to military service that I fit into.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of people who felt the same way I did, who didn't happen to be born into a Quaker family and didn't get that sort of automatic lift.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I'm so sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
What was the job you did do for the 2 years? What was it officially titled, or?
So, as a conscientious objector, you had to go out and find a civilian job, and then the draft board had to approve it. So the first thing I did was I said, I'll join the Army and be a medic, because they didn't carry weapons. And they were like, son, you don't want to be a medic, because the survival rate for medics was really low. I mean, it's a very, very dangerous job. So I said, okay. So I went to a Quaker relief agency, and they said, we have a rehabilitation hospital in Vietnam, and we need a truck driver mechanic. I was like, I'll do that. That'd be great. I'd love to do that. So I went to the draft board, and they're like, you can't go to Vietnam. It's too far from home. I was like, but you're sending everybody else there. Anyway, they wouldn't approve that. So I ended up working in Philadelphia for this Quaker relief agency, and I'm basically being a file clerk. I didn't do anything positive. It wasn't interesting or fun, didn't draw on my talents. So it was pretty much a waste of time, unfortunately.
Sorry. Thank you.
So between then and then your first assignment in Africa, what did you do?
Yeah, so I eventually got my degree, and I went to work for a weekly newspaper in the Chicago suburbs, and it was a great first journalism job because I had to do everything. So I covered the cops, and I covered the school board and the planning commission, and everything that happened in this rather large town, I covered that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great job because that's where I learned to be accurate. And I remember I had an editor who was this grumpy old guy, probably younger than I am now, but he seemed like a grumpy old guy at the time. And there was this terrible thing that happened where a teenage boy drowned in a local creek. And I had to go to the family. And so I heard the sirens and went there when they were trying to find the body. And I saw them pull the body out of the water. And it was just horrible. And then I had to go to the family and ask for a picture and sort of interview them. And they were in the middle of shock and grief. And it was really an awful experience for them, but a little bit for me. And anyway, I got back to the newsroom and I wrote my story. And because it was a weekly paper, that this editor said, "What's this person's date of? When was he born? When's his birthday? What's his date of birth?" And I said, "I don't know. He's 14." And he said, "Well, but in the week that we have before the story is published, he could, it could be that he's, older.
Mm-hmm.
So you need his date of birth. I don't want to know just how old he is. I want to know what his date of birth is." And I was like, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, go back to the family." And by this time, it's like 10 o'clock at night.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to go knock on the door. They just lost their son that day. And it was a good lesson for me because ever since then, I've got written down not just the person I'm interviewing and a full name and a middle name and an address and a phone number and email address and everything else, but date of birth.
Mm-hmm.
And when I ask people that, they're always like, "Why do you want to know that?" And it's just because it's important to know.
Uh-huh.
And it was a good lesson. So I learned all kinds of sort of hard lessons like that, being a local journalist. Also, I found out pretty quickly, if I was writing a story that involved the cops and I got something wrong, the cops would come across the street into my office and start pounding on my desk.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like immediate feedback. And also because I got to, I got to learn about cops, and I learned about school boards, and I learned about local government, and I learned about traffic, and it was a great job. So I did that for about a year and a half, and then I still wanted to be a Time magazine correspondent. And so I started stringing for Time. And what that meant was, if they had they thought something might be a good story, but they didn't have anybody to cover it, and it wasn't that important, they'd say, hey, Wood, why don't you go, write something about this parade or whatever it was. And so I started doing that, so we got to sort of know each other, and then after a year and a half, they asked me to come on as a full-time correspondent, which I did. So I worked in the Chicago bureau for 2 years, and that was fun because I covered. I had a geographical area that I covered. So part of that was West Virginia, and so I went to cover the coal miners, and they were having a coal miner election, the coal miner union election, and so I wrote about that, and I spent a lot of time with people who were running for office in the coal miners union, and this was like nothing I'd ever seen before because they were all armed, and there was a lot of violence, and it was in that environment it was dangerous, kind of cool. And so I did all that kind of stuff, and then there was also during that time in South Dakota, at one of the Indian reservations, there was an insurrection, and it was a place called Wounded Knee, and it was a big deal because I think that they take some people hostage. I can't really remember, but it was a big confrontation between the feds and the Indians at a standoff, and I think some people were shot and maybe killed. I don't remember the details, but anyway, so I went to South Dakota, and it was the farthest west I'd ever been. I was like, whoa, no trees out here. It was bizarre, and so that was kind of fun, and so I did that for 2 years, and then I went to the Boston bureau, and I did the same kind of thing. I did a lot of reporting outdoors. So I spent some time with oceanographers and fishermen, and I spent a lot of time at sea from writing about stuff that was going on in that area. And I wrote about ski races, and I just had a good time, And so I was in Boston for about 2 years, and then I did a story on a court decision, and this was instrumental in me getting to Africa. So I think it was the Wampanoag Indians in Massachusetts who sued the federal government. And what they wanted was the U.S. Justice Department to be their legal guardians, which sounds like a small thing. But what it meant was if they could get the Justice Department to be their legal guardians, it meant that the Justice Department would be their lawyers in getting their land back. And they used to own most of the land in New England. So in effect, what this court case was about was, does the federal government start taking people's houses, land away from them? Everybody who lived in New England was like, whoa, how could that happen? Anyway, the case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court eventually said, yeah, according to this treaty, the Justice Department does have to be their legal guardian. I was like, okay, this is important. So I wrote a story, sent it to New York. And this was at a time when Time magazine, being a weekly magazine, we did the reporting during the week. We filed our stories like on a Thursday. On Friday, they would be all ready. And and I didn't hear anything about the story. So I called up and I said, what about the Wampanoag Indian story? And they were like, that's not going in the magazine. I was like, why not? And they said, well, the editor doesn't think that the Indians should have any access to American jurisprudence. I was like, okay, that's fine for him to have that opinion, but the Supreme Court just ruled.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, well, he's not going to put it in the magazine. I said, so this was when I was young and I had a bit of a temper. I said, put me through to his office. So his secretary answered. I said, hey, it's Dave Wood in the Boston Bureau. I wanted to talk to Henry Grunwald about this story. She was like, they're in a conference. I said, well, put me on hold. She said, okay. So she put me on hold. I got my coat on, left the phone on hold, went down in the elevator, took a taxi to Logan Airport, took the shuttle to New York, took a taxi to the Time Life building, went up to the 34th floor, burst into Henry Grunwald's office where he was having his conference. And we had a sort of physical altercation. At the end of which he said, I want this person sent as far away. I never want to see Dave Wood. I never want to see him again. Send him as far away from here as you can. And we're like, well, we have an opening in Nairobi. So I ended up going to Africa, which was great. It was really great. But as I say, there I arrive in Nairobi, never been to Africa before, hugely excited, and New York wanted me to cover the war in Angola, the war in Mozambique, the war in Uganda, there were wars everywhere. That's what they wanted. Mm-hmm. I had no idea about how to do that. So I just went. Mm-hmm. And, kind of painfully embarrassing how unprepared I was. I mean, if you could think of anybody who would be worse prepared to do that, a conscientious objector with no experience in war. Are you kidding me? Anyway, so that's what I did. And, I was like, after I sort of got over the shock of it, and I was like, this is pretty interesting stuff. Mm-hmm. This is interesting. People grappling with real problems, and especially I felt some affinity with local people who were fighting against colonial masters. Mm-hmm. Like in almost every country in Africa at that time, either they had just fought or were in the middle of fighting a war against their, like in Mozambique, the Portuguese ran that country. The white Portuguese ran a country. It's a black African country. Mm-hmm. And the local people wanted to boot them out. And so there was a lot of fighting going on. And also in those young liberation movements, they had, Russian backing. But they were also interesting places where, for example, in the guerrilla movement in Mozambique that was fighting against the Portuguese, women held an equal place in their fighting units. I was like, wow, that's interesting, because that was, way ahead of its time. And they also had a sort of a rough version of democracy where they would have meetings to figure out, what their strategy should be and where they should invest the little money they had and that kind of thing. And it was, I was like, this is pretty interesting stuff. Mm-hmm. There was the fighting part of it, but there was also, they were grappling with real issues of how do we govern ourselves? After we throw off the colonial people, how do we then organize our society? And one thing we want is, women have full equality. We want some form of democracy, and we have to figure out how that works. How do you do that? And I remember going to a big meeting in Mozambique after there was a lot of fighting, and they finally got, they staked out a place that was pretty stable, and then they had a meeting, and the Frelimo, the guerrilla sort of leaders were like, okay, y'all get together and you're going to elect somebody to represent you at the next higher level. And they were like, well, on what basis do we elect people? And he's like, well, I don't know, it's sort of up to you. So there was a guy who wanted to run for their representative who stood up and said, I want to be your representative and y'all should vote for me. And then there was this huge controversy because he was this womanizer who'd, screwed half the women in the village, and the husbands hated him. And it was this, like, you're disqualified, because you're an immoral person. And he goes, well, there's no law against that. And it was kind of interesting because they were grappling with democracy at the very basic kind of level. Who gets to be qualified to run for office? It was pretty interesting. So that the whole, so I spent almost 4 years doing that, and it was just endlessly fascinating to see people dealing with being oppressed and also, being involved in combat at a very basic kind of level. Like I remember being in Ethiopia or Eritrea. I hung out with a group of fighters, and they were, I think some of them were university students, but the university had been blown up, and so they were like halfway through their education. But they weren't professional military people at all, but they were fighting a war. And one night I went to a wedding of 2 fighters. One of them was a guy who'd been hit in the head by shrapnel or something, and he was dying. And he was clearly dying, and he had a bandage around his head. And then the woman he was marrying was, she was a member of I forget what the name of this squad was, but these were women who would run down out of the hills with a hand grenade and climb up on a Russian tank that the Ethiopian army had and pop the grenade down the hatch. I mean, it was like a suicide mission. And so these 2 people were getting married, and their long-term prospects were pretty gloomy, but it was the most joyful occasion I have ever been to. I mean, it was just, and I had brought a bottle of whiskey, which was passed around. There was a big fire. People were dancing and laughing, and it was so full of life. I was like, and I had a lot of experiences like that, which were just brilliant and easy to write about. So.
Did your opinion of war change at all during this time?
I came to have a very high regard for, which I hadn't had before, for people who were caught up in it. So, like a lot of the first people I met who had anything to do, who were fighters, were people who didn't want to be fighters, but they were sort of pushed in that position because they were overcome by injustice and oppression. And are like, okay, this is our last resort. We have to do this because it's no way to live as, being oppressed. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. I hadn't really, and as I came to know these people and understand that because of the logistical difficulty of covering wars in Africa, I would travel it would take me sometimes weeks to get to, where the fighting was going on. And then I'd be there for like a month. So I got to know people. And I began to see how these things happened and what the motivation of people was. Not that they wanted to do this, but they felt like there was no alternative. There was no honorable alternative. And, then in the many cases I saw where women and children were killed, and that set off this kind of vicious reaction. It's like, I remember being with fighters whose families had been killed, and they were like, I'm fighting to the death. And I got that, in a way that I never would have had I not been living with them. And in some cases gotten to know their families, and then, they got killed. And so it did change, it was like up until that point, everything that I thought about war and conflict was academic. And all of a sudden, I was in it. And I was like, oh, wait a second, this is different. This is more complicated than I thought. And I guess that's where I still am, that it's more complicated than I had thought.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel safe when you were in Africa?
Oh, God, no. I was terrified the whole time. I was absolutely terrified, almost for 4 years.
Okay.
And part of it, in very few cases was there any direct terror, like I'm about to be killed.
Okay.
That did happen, but most of it was anticipatory, like I'm going to get on an airplane at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm flying into some place on a rickety airplane that that ordinarily I wouldn't get on. And then I'm going to land in some place where there's a lot of people being killed, and I won't know anybody there, and I will have no way to get home, and I'll just be out there. Uh-oh. And so it was always like, but then it'd be like, but I really want to know what's going on out there. And so there were very few times when I thought, this is too dangerous to go. I'm not going to do this. Because I always felt like, Time Magazine sent me all the way out there, put me up in a nice house in Nairobi. My wife and kids lived there. The kids were going to school. I was getting well paid. It wasn't like I was like, well, I'm too scared to go. That wouldn't work. And then when I'd get there, it was like, there was always a situation where you're someplace and there's a dirt road that goes right into where you can hear the fighting going on. And there's probably landmines in the road. And I'm like, do I have to go down that road to find out what's going on? Yeah, I probably do. And so there was, there was a few times when I just thought, whatever story's down the end of that road's not worth the chance of getting blown up. So I'm not gonna go. And then the other thing that I was scared about was not getting killed. That would be okay. It was getting wounded that I worried about, because there were no medics or medevac or anything like that. It was just like, if you were wounded, you're on your own. And not being a seasoned war correspondent, I never carried any first aid stuff. It never even occurred to me to do that. I was just scared, I was just scared. And luckily I never did get wounded,
Fear will get you through some things.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
When at the end of the assignment, when you returned home, did you have a different outlook on American life after witnessing this for 4 years?
I did, because I got home, and first of all, nobody knew anything about Africa and really didn't care about anything going on there. So there wasn't a lot of interest in what I knew. And the other thing was that people seemed to have very simplistic notions about war and why it happened and what that was like. And because I'd had that experience, when I came back, I went to Washington, and I was assigned to cover the Pentagon and more broadly national security. So I covered, I was at the White House a lot, and the State Department, and the Pentagon a lot. And one of the curious things, so that was 1981 through 2000, say. And during that time, I had more combat experience than almost everybody in the United States military, which was weird and bizarre, because I've never been in the military, but I'd spent all that time at war. So people were always saying, so I hear you covered guerrilla wars in Africa. I was like, yeah, I did that. And they were like, what's it like? Because these people that I knew in the military had been training and training and training for war, but never been to war. And they were dying to know, am I going to be able to do this? How's that going to be? What's it like? And it was sort of embarrassing, because, I'm not a military person. But So for a couple of years, I was like the typical Washington correspondent. So I went to all the briefings, and I traveled around the world with the Secretary of Defense, which is a thing you do. And that was fun. But then I discovered like the military's out there all the time. And starting in about 1981 or 1982, the military started doing these very realistic combat exercises. And they built a couple of training areas out in California. The Marines and the Army did, and the Air Force had its red flag exercises. So they were really realistic combat training. And I was like, can I go out there with you guys? And we're like, do you want to? And I was like, yeah. So I started spending most of my time out in the field with the military. And again, not the headquarters generals or anything like that. These are the, the trigger pullers and the wrench turners and the motor pool people and the forklift drivers and the ammunition haulers, the artillery people and the jet mechanics and all those people. That's who I hung out with for, most of the 1980s and 1990s. And then when there were wars like the war in Bosnia, then I went to I just went and covered that. But most of the time I spent with the U.S. military. And I spent one year I spent with a Marine battalion, because I was talking to some Marines one time, and I was like, I don't really get what you guys do. I don't really understand it. What, and they said, well, you got to do a pump. They said, what's a pump? And they said, well, we have this thing called the Marine Expeditionary Unit, and it's like a Marine battalion, and it's married up with an aviation unit and a bunch of other things, and they train up for 6 months, and then they go to sea for 6 months, and they go to trouble spots. I was like, yeah, I'd like to do that. So I did that for a year. I spent a year with the Marine Battalion, and it was just fabulous. I mean, I learned so much. And it was fun because, at first the Marines were like, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm, writing about what you guys do. They're like, well, cool. And then they couldn't get over the fact that I was there voluntarily. They're like, you could go home anytime you want, right? I was like, yeah. They said, well, why don't you? This sucks out here. And I was like, but it's interesting, but they took good care of me. And I think they sort of felt like, at that point I was in my late 40s or early 50s, so I was like twice as old as everybody else there. And they kind of felt like, we got to take care of this guy because, he's not a Marine, doesn't really know what he's doing. So, and that was fun, and I learned a lot. One thing I especially learned was this thing about camaraderie, which is so hard to understand and talk about in the civilian world. But, I could see that, so I'd also spent a lot of time at Marine boot camp and Army basic training and Navy basic training. Because I was always like, I wonder who's coming into the military these days. So I go spend a couple of weeks at boot camp. And one thing I noticed was that, the very first thing that happens is that the drill sergeant counts people off by twos. They said, this is your battle buddy. You're responsible for this person, no matter what. And everybody's like, yeah, and they don't get it, And then like a couple of days later or a week later, they're on the obstacle course, and some kid doesn't get over the obstacle course, and a drill sergeant drops everybody for push-ups on hard gravel. And they're like, what? And they're like, I told you were responsible no matter what. You let him fail. Not acceptable. And then over time, that rule becomes an internal value, right? And it's so hard to explain to civilians how this happens. But I watched it in this Marine battalion, new guys coming in, and then every day in some small way, they got to step up to that responsibility, that you're responsible for your buddy. And so you take fire watch for him, or some other act of kindness. And then by the time you get into combat, there's this like unconditional devotion to each other's welfare, which is just brilliant to see. And and I felt a little bit of that because they always felt responsible for me. But that unconditional devotion, it's so hard to explain to people who have, and if I hadn't spent this year with the Marines, I probably would have missed how deep that goes. And when people come back and get out of the Marines or the military, what a loss that is. So all of a sudden, all the people you love most in the world are gone, and you don't have anybody loving you in that very specific kind of way. And that's hard, So anyway.
When 9/11 happened, and it seemed that the United States was going to go to war again.
Yeah.
Did you think, whatever happens, I'm going to go?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. So I was in Washington, went to the Pentagon. I mean, it was a crazy kind of a day because it had started so beautifully, and it was a crisp autumn day, and then all that happened, and we were afraid that we would. I mean, we assumed, so the 2 trade towers were hit, and then the Pentagon was hit, and then we thought there was a lot more coming. So we were pretty sure we were all going to be killed, in the newsroom in Washington. So that was unsettling. And then right after that happened, there was the anthrax scare. So people were getting anthrax packages in the mail. And then right after that happened, there was a sniper in Washington, 2 guys who were driving around killing people like at gas stations. And so the whole period was very, very unsettling. And I remember when the sniper incident was happening in Washington, and it went on for like 10 days because I couldn't find the people who were doing it. I was down at Fort Benning, and my wife called, and she said, "There's a sniper here killing people." And I said, "Where?" She said, "Right in our town." I was like, "Oh my God." And so I'm on the phone, and I'm talking to a bunch of infantry guys, and I hung up the phone, and they were like, "What's going on?" I said, "There's a sniper in Kensington, Maryland." They're like, "Let's go. We'll go get him." They were, and I knew the military. There was going to be deployments, and so I had been working with the 10th Mountain Division up at Fort Drum in northern New York, and I knew they were going to go because they're a light infantry unit, and they were, and I knew a lot of people there, and so I kept calling them up saying, "When you guys go, I want to go with you." They were like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And it happened that I was in a Safeway buying groceries, and my phone rang, and it was the commanding general of the 10th Mountain Division, and he said, "Get your ass over here. We're going." So I went with them, and that was January of 2003, or 2002. So it was right at the very beginning of the U.S. military buildup in Afghanistan. So I spent 3.5 months there with them, and then I just kept going back. So that was after 2000, after the terrorist attacks, and I remember talking to guys who were military police, and they were in charge of Afghan prisoners. And I remember asking them, how long are you going to keep these people? Because they're enemy combatants, but there's no declared war, and there's not going to be ever any end to it, because at that point, President Bush was talking about, this is generational. So I was like, you have to keep these guys here forever. How is that going to work? And he goes, I don't have the slightest idea. And that was, that was probably late January 2002. So those prisoners are still prisoners. And it's weird. But it was interesting that nobody had any idea how this was going to unfold. It was just day-to-day decisions. And I remember the senior military person there at, this was Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. He was saying, we want a really small footprint. We're not going to build, barracks or anything like that. And it was primitive living. I mean, there were no showers. The mess hall was a tent. The latrines were, plywood shacks at best. So it was pretty primitive. But then all that changed. And the last time I was there, there are like skyscraper barracks, and there's like, it's huge. So.
What year was that?
The last time I was there?
Yes, sir.
It was 2012 or 13.
Okay. Thank you.
So after covering Afghanistan, did you go to Iraq when that kicked off?
Yes, I did. And that was something that I learned as a reporter, as a military reporter, was that the military, not surprisingly, has a gigantic and powerful public affairs arm. And their job is to put a good face on everything. And they see their job as controlling reporters. And reporters saw their job as trying to get out from, get away from the public affairs people. And so when I went to Iraq, I flew into Baghdad. I flew into Kuwait and was trying to figure out how to get into Iraq. And there were these convoys going all the time. And I was with a public affairs guy who was tracking me. And I had learned by that point that it was useful to carry fatigues and a helmet and a flak vest, because then you could look like everybody else. And I learned that pretty early on when I was trying to escape the public affairs whole thing. And so I put on my stuff and I walked down to the airstrip, and there were guys loading mailboxes on a helicopter. This was years before. This was during the first Gulf War. And I said, where are you guys going? They said, we're going up to I-Corps. And I said, can I have a ride? They were like, hop on. They had no idea who I was. And off I went. And, like a couple of weeks later, when I got back to headquarters, the public affairs guys were like, where have you been? I was like, no. But anyway, I found it very useful to sort of put on fatigues and disappear inside the military community. And then guys would be like, who's that dude? He's older than everybody else here, probably a general officer, but he's got no insignia, so could be CIA, we better treat him well. So it was very useful.
So tell us more about that dynamic, because you obviously had combat experience covering other wars.
Yeah.
And then especially early on in Iraq and Afghanistan, you're with guys that are 18, 19, 20 years old who's never been away from home.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? I'm sure there's some lines that kind of get blurred between a journalist and a service member.
Oh, yeah. So I saw my job as disappearing inside their organization and getting them to forget that I was a reporter. Because what I increasingly saw my job as not writing about, like the big geostrategic story, but who are these people and what are they doing and what's it like for them? That's what I wanted to write about, because every time I go home, people back home in the States would have no idea who was in the military and why they were there and what their lives were like and what they ate, where they went to the bathroom and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I wanted to write about. And, almost everybody that I met in the military was happy to have me there. And they were just like, it always happened that I'd show up at some battalion or a squadron or something, and I'd go see the commander, and he'd say, well, delighted to have you here. Go anywhere, talk to anybody. My folks are great people. They're all great stories. If you have any problems, let me know. And if you come across anything classified, let's talk about it. And so I pretty much had total run of every place, and it was great. And and the lines did blur to the extent that, you know, when you're on a combat foot patrol, it really doesn't matter if you're a journalist or an infantryman. You're all, you know, in that environment together, and when bad stuff happens, it happens to all of you, you know. And if somebody steps on an IED, journalist or infantryman, the result is the same. So it's that shared, not shared danger, but shared rigor. You know, life is hard when you go to war. And whether you're living on an air base or wherever you are, whatever you're doing, it's hard. You know, the food is, you know, not great, and you're away from home, and there's all that stuff. And so sharing that and my, in their eyes, being willing to come out and hang out with them for months at a time gave me a lot of credit, and they gave me a lot of credit, and so it kind of worked, you know. And that's how they could share really intimate stories with me, because they trusted that I would get it, you know. People who felt guilty because, you know, a buddy got shot and they didn't see the sniper, and they're like, you know, it's my fault, that kind of thing. And so I was hugely privileged to have people share their stories with me because I was there. And so, I mean, what an honor for a journalist to be able to do that. It was really pretty terrific.
They trusted you with their story. Did you trust them for your protection?
Oh, God, yeah. I can't tell you the number of times somebody said, hey, Mr. Wood, why don't you grab a weapon, you know? I was like, you don't want me to have a weapon because I'm not that good at it. If it comes to it, I'll take one and defend us, but I'm a really good writer, so let me do that. You're a really good rifleman, you do that, and we'll get along just fine. But yeah, I mean, I tried not to be a burden. And so one of the things that I did during all those years that I would go out and hang out with the military in the field, I was always learning stuff. I was like, okay, don't bother carrying this, but you got to have this. And you know, when there's an ambush or when you come under artillery attack, do this, don't do that. And all this kind of practical, like field craft that I wish I'd known in Africa, now I was learning. And then I took courses, like I took combat life-saving course, and I took air assault course, and I took winter survival course, and I did jungle training. And I went to ranger school, which, by the way, I was terrible at. And I didn't have to do anything except be there. And so, you know, I learned a lot from all these people. And I saw it as part of my job to, you know, so when there was a deployment, you know, I sort of knew what to take, how to carry it, what to do, not to be in the way. And so I was lucky in that way that I had that time to learn about being a reporter on the battlefield. And by the way, when I was during the 80s and 90s, when I was spending a lot of time out in the field with the military, they had this thing called reporter on the battlefield. And the military was really proud about this. And they'd have some off-duty guys playing reporters. And I was like, first of all, these guys are terrible. No reporter would do that. And why don't you get some real reporters out here? So I would go back to the Pentagon and talk to all the reporters there, and I say, hey, look, you know, the Air Force will fly you down there. You can live with the Marines or the Army for, you know, for 3 or 4 days, be in their war games, be a great story, and it's hugely fun. Dead silence. Nobody ever went, ever. I was the only one who did it. I couldn't, you know, and so they'd have these stupid reporter on the battlefield things where, you know, they would supposedly have, interviews, and the soldiers and Marines and Air Force guys would learn how to talk to a reporter, what not to say, and all that kind of stuff. It was kind of lame. And I was always sad that more reporters didn't go out into the field with the military. And so after 9/11, when it looked like, the military was all of a sudden like, we ought to have a bunch of people like Wood, who can go out and live with the infantry company, But and there were a lot of reporters whose bosses were saying, you got to go do military stuff now. And then people were like, I never did that. So the Army called me up and they said, we're going to have a boot camp for journalists about how to be an embedded journalist. And you're the only one who's done it. So we want you to come down to teach the course. I was like, no, I don't work for you guys. I don't do that. Then I thought about it and I thought, no, okay, I probably should do that. So I went down to Fort Benning and spent a week training, just telling reporters how to do this, how to behave. And the hardest thing was getting them to understand that you can be with the military, but you're not part of them. And it's not to think about we, it's to think about them. Because once you start identifying too closely with the military, with the people you're with, then you start shading your reporting. And there always comes a time when you got to write something that they're not going to like. And that's hard, because you may be way downstream, downrange in some war zone, and you don't have any friends except the guys you're with, and you got to write about how they screwed something up. That's not a comfortable position. I've been in that several times, but you got to be ready to do that. Otherwise, why are you there? So.
How many times did you go over to Iraq or Afghanistan since?
Oh gosh,
2002?
I probably went to Afghanistan like 8 times, 9 times. So I'd pretty much go, spend a couple of months there, come back for a month or 8 weeks, and then go back again. And then when Iraq came, I didn't go as often, but I tended to stay longer. So I probably went to Iraq, I don't know, 6 or 8 times. I don't know, it's hard to remember. But I went pretty much, that's what I did. I went and I came back and then I went again. So it was pretty regular.
So earlier you said civilians do this, and you said you mentioned how civilians act versus how military people act. What do you consider yourself? Are you a combat journalist? Are you a military? What is the title you give yourself?
I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist who's occasionally been to war and have some insights about that, but I have been very clear about that. Even when I'm at war and embedded with a military unit, I'm not one of them. I don't do what they do, and even though I'm there and I share a lot of experiences, the fact that they have a job there to do that's different from mine really separates us, and especially the combat arms people. I mean, their job is to kill people, and that's not my job, and that's a huge difference. And so I've always been very clear that I can tell part of their stories. I can understand a little bit about what they do and why they do it. I can know their families a little bit, and that's one thing I've tried really hard to do. So a lot of times, I go live with a bunch of people on deployment, and then I ask, would you mind if I talk to your wife and your kids? And they're like, no, I love that. So then I go talk to them and get to know them a little bit. So it's I can write more accurately or with greater insight into what their lives are like, But I've always been very clear that I'm an observer there, and I've never been to boot camp. I've never been in uniform. It's a whole different thing. So I'm a journalist.
You mentioned at the beginning of the interview that when you were growing up in a Quaker family, you almost had an unfavorable opinion or perspective on service members.
Yeah.
How has that changed since being a
I
journalist?
used to have conversations with my mother about this, and I'd say, there's a lot of good people in the military, and they're grappling with this big problem, which is how do we stop bad things from happening? She was like, well, okay, tell me about, and she could never quite bring herself to be, but to feel like she would like people in the military. Although some of the people I told her about, she'd be like, well, I could like that guy or that person or that woman. So my feeling changed dramatically because, when I was growing up, first of all, we never met anybody in the military. There were always some sort of distant, boogeyman. And the only people that we knew who had been in the military were like my uncles who were in World War II, and that was different because they weren't that anymore. They weren't military people. They were just people who'd happened to be in the military for a short period of time and then did something else. I remember one of the first experiences I had as a journalist covering the American military was I flew with a Marine colonel who, and we went, I forget where, I think we went to Panama. Anyway, we were on this plane for a pretty long period of time, and then we were together for a couple days. And, he looked like the quintessential Marine, right? Tight collar, red neck spilling over, beefy kind of guy. And I thought, well, okay, this is a typical Marine, probably not too bright, Turned out he had 2 doctorate degrees. This guy was brilliant. And, he was a war fighter, and he would tell me about firefights he'd been in Vietnam, which were just horrendous. But he was a smart guy. And I was like, so not what I expected. 2 PhDs. And so inevitably, of course, over time, I came to see people in the military as, as people who had something which I didn't have when I was growing up, and that is they were serving an ideal. There was some nobility in what they were trying to do, even though the reality often wasn't so noble. Being in an air squadron or, it's often just hard work and it's hard to see the nobility in it. But this idea of serving an ideal, the idea of service, first of all, and then serving an ideal, and then this whole camaraderie thing, I was like, this is not what I thought the military was. This is way better. And, and so that's one reason why I kept going back, I wanted to be part of this. It was good. So my feeling about military people changed dramatically. Yeah.
As Iraq and Afghanistan went on, and you kept going back, and did you notice a mindset and the change of the troops serving over there?
I don't think so. Although that's an interesting question, and I have to think about it. But on the surface, at least, my impression is that people would go, even on their second and third deployment, with some sense of adventure and excitement. And then that would sort of wear off over time. And one of the things that my editors kept wanting me to write about was, what does the average grunt think about the Afghanistan war? And I'd always have to say, they don't think anything about it. It's like, you go to war, you're a mortarman in a weapons company, or you're a aircraft, a helicopter mechanic, or whatever it is that you are, your view of the war is like very, very narrow. And to ask somebody like that, what do you think about the war? I would get blank stares. Like, I have no freaking idea. I'm just here doing my job, and I'm good at it, and I like it, and I like the people I'm with, but that's like 10 people. That's it. That's my whole war. And it was very hard to convince my editors that, people rarely had a stratospheric view of the war. Although, people would always say, well, this is completely screwed up. But that was sort of like an emotional reaction. And on the few times that, the subject would come up, I'd always have some, very junior person saying, well, what the U.S. ought to be doing, and then launch into this big geostrategic thing and critique of the president and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and how they're screwed up and everything. And I'd be like, I'm not going to quote you on any of this because it would just get you in trouble. So thanks for your opinion. But, by and large, I found people were proud of what they were doing, thought it was worthwhile in their own in their own environment. Like, my job is to keep this F-16 in pristine condition so that when the pilot gets in it and goes, it'll behave perfectly. That's my war. And I'm proud, I'm good at it. That's pretty much what I found of everybody in the military. They had a job, they were doing it well, they thought it was worth doing. They were proud that, that the president would say, we're proud of you, and, when they come home. And it was always, for me, always embarrassing to come home with a unit because, you'd fly into, from Afghanistan, you'd fly to Kyrgyzstan and then get a plane which would always end up refueling in Gander or someplace like that. So everybody get off the plane, and then they'd have this long line of people, civilians, saying, thank you for your service, and they'd be handing out candy bars and stuff. And I was always be in the line, right? And I've got fatigues on, so they were thanking me for my service, and I'm like, no, actually, I'm just a reporter. It was always sort of embarrassing, but heartwarming too, because, people really have a good feeling about their military and appreciate what they're doing, even if they don't understand it.
Do you have a fondness for a particular branch from all of your
Well,
experience?
yeah, the Marines will always be my favorite, because I spent that year with the Marines, and then by happenstance, I spent a lot of time with them in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And a part of that, I think, is, I spent some time with the Marine Battalion in Iraq, and then a couple of years later, they're in Afghanistan. I'm like, hey, can I hang out with you guys? Sure. And they know me, I know them, and so I go. And I spent a lot of time in boot camp with Marines, and I just by happenstance have written more about Marines than anybody else.
Okay. You've been through a lot. It's a lot of experiences. How's your mental health?
I've thought a lot about it. A lot of people have asked me that question, and I guess I'm not smart enough or self-aware enough to be like, wow, I really suffered, But, I think of all the hard things that I've been through, and I think being a journalist insulates you a little bit from that, because I'm always thinking of things as a what are the elements of a story in this situation? So like, you know, a bad firefight or you know, something like that that happens. I'm like, how am I going to tell this? Who are my characters? And, you know, let me remember the little details of, you know, the heat or the, you know, what it smelled like or stuff like that, that it's got to be in my story. And so, in a sense, you're sort of at a remove from what's going on, from the immediacy of what's going on. I mean, I remember there being in Afghanistan one time, and there was a pretty substantial firefight going on, and I was huddled down with the command element, and we were taking a lot of RPG fire, which is kind of terrifying. And I was trying to file a story, and so I had my laptop open, and it was like dusk, and I was connected up to the satellite, and so I always would, you know, I'd write my story, and then I'd attach it to an email and send it by email. And so I was trying to attach my story to the email. And guys were shouting at me because the computer screen was putting out light. And they were like, Wood, shut that thing down. And I was like, okay, just a second. And stuff was going on overhead. But I was in my own little journalism world and not really connected to what was going on. Well, I was so insulated a little bit, I think is a way to think about it. So I don't think that those experiences impacted me as much as they did them. Okay. You know. So here's another example. When I was in Afghanistan in 2008, my mother died when I was deployed, and so my wife emailed me and said, call me. So I called her on the satellite phone, and she said, your mother died, and your sister was there, and is there somewhere you can go to be by yourself? And, you know, and I looked around. It was the middle of the day in Afghanistan, and it was bright sun and noisy and stuff going on, and there was no place you could go be by yourself. So I wrote about that experience because it gave me such an insight into what everybody who goes to war experiences, which is stuff happens at home. You know, your mother dies, or a baby is born, or, you know, or your daughter gets, you know, hits a home run in Little League, or, you know, stuff like that happens, which are big life experiences, which you're not a part of. You hear about them, but and then it comes and goes. It's gone, you know. Something big happened and you missed it, and you're at war or deployed, and, you know, it gave me such an insight into what we ask of people when we send them overseas, or when they deploy, because they miss stuff like that, and you never get it back. So, but again, it was weird because I was like, mother died, okay, that's a data point. And I didn't really feel it because it was like distant, and I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain, but a lot of things happened when I was deployed in a war zone like that, you know, like, I don't really feel the full impact of it because I'm sort of divorced from it. Pardon me.
Do you have any regrets or things that you wish you'd done or hadn't done during these experiences?
I wish that I had figured out quicker, figured out quicker what was going on with people in the military. It took me a long time to figure out, and especially this whole thing about moral injury, which I didn't realize until basically, you know, I'd been doing this for been at war for 15 years, or 14 years, that experiences happen to people which are deeply, which really become part of your deepest kind of emotions. And it's very hard to carry those and impossible to explain them to people who weren't there. And so people walk around with these experiences that they can't really talk about, that are either, they're both painful and sometimes have feelings of guilt and shame, and sometimes are feelings of intense joy. And pardon me, some of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life happened in a combat unit at war. Funniest jokes, funniest situations. I mean, things like you can't even remember it without falling down on the ground and have tears squirting out of your eyes. You're laughing so hard. And you try to explain it to somebody and they're like, huh, that's funny. And they're like, they don't get it. And so many things like that are internalized with so many veterans that I know that they can't really talk about except with each other. And that's too bad, because I think that we civilians need to know that. Well, we don't need to know the jokes. Okay, some of them are pretty profane. But when it comes time for us to consider whether we're going to send young Americans into harm's way somewhere, we need to understand what it is that we're asking of them. You know, when they're gone, their mother will die, or, you know, they're going to have these experiences which will be with them forever, and that's asking a lot. And you know, when we send 19-year-olds into harm's way somewhere, they don't know what's going to happen. They have no clue. And so we need to know that. And so then, you know, when it comes time for us voters to make a decision about, you know, do we send people to war or not, we need to understand what that entails. And we need to know what it's like for people we send. So, and that's really why I've continued to do this kind of work, because I just think it's so critical in a democracy that we do understand that. That we know, you know, what's that going to be like for them? Yeah.
What message would you like to leave for future generations? That one would be hearing this interview, just about your experiences.
Well, I guess the one that I was just talking about, you know, I'm not so important. There are a lot of people who do what I do. You know, reporters who are out there on the battlefield, real reporters this time on real battlefields, and they're out there telling stories of the men and women that we send to war. That's great. And so there's nothing special about me, but I do think it's important for us as news consumers to pay attention to what's going on and to absorb those stories of people who we send to war, and to have some appreciation for, you know, I mean, it's not just that we have a Defense Department and they recruit people and they train them and they send them off somewhere and we don't really have anything to do with that. No, we do. You know, we're part of that decision-making process, and we can't make decisions when it comes to voting about those big questions of war and peace unless we have some sense of, you know, who are these people? What are we asking of a 19-year-old when we recruit him or her into military service? What is it that we're really asking? And then when it comes time to send them somewhere, is it worth it? You know? Knowing what this is going to be like for them. So that's the message I would leave for anybody else, is that it's important that we know what veterans have done, so that we can make informed decisions about using them when they're in military service. And then when they come home, we can have some better sense when we say thank you for your service, that we really know what we're talking about, because I don't think many of us do now. And it's nice that people say thank you for your service, but it would be better, I think, if we had a deeper understanding of what that means.
Well, that's about all we have then. Mr. Wood, thank you so much
Okay.
for being here. Really appreciate it.
This was great fun.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
All right. Well, that concludes the interview of David Wood.